Hello everyone. In today's story, we're diving into something truly extraordinary. A tale of heartbreak, courage, and the power of human connection that defied every cruel expectation. It's a story about a broke widow and a paralyzed Apache warrior. Two people everyone had written off, until they proved the whole world wrong. So, sit tight and listen closely, because by the end of this, you'll believe in second chances again. In the late 1870s, deep in the Arizona Territory, the sun burned low and mean, turning the land into red fire. Dust rose like ghosts from the earth, curling around the broken fences and half-rotted cabins that dotted the frontier. Among them stood one belonging to Margaret Lane, a woman not yet 40, but with grief lines cut into her face like riverbeds. Her husband, Thomas, had been a prospector, a dreamer, who'd left her with nothing but a name and a debt collector's shadow. Margaret lived on scraps. Her hands, once soft from piano keys, were rough now from digging potatoes out of dry earth. The neighbors whispered when they passed her small homestead, some out of pity, others out of cruel amusement. A woman alone in that land was as good as forgotten. Then came the day that changed everything. The local militia arrived one morning, dragging a wagon with a man inside. They called him Taza, once a proud Apache warrior, now paralyzed from the waist down after a bullet tore through his spine during the territorial wars. They said the army didn't want him, the reservation didn't want him, and since no one else would take him, they'd gift him to the widow Lane. The men laughed when they said it, as if giving her a broken man was a punchline. "He can keep you company," one of them joked. "Maybe he'll scare the coyotes off." Margaret said nothing. She just stood there in her worn dress, the wind pulling at her hair, her jaw tight as she stared into the wagon. Taza's dark eyes met hers, calm, proud, unblinking. He didn't beg, he didn't curse, he simply was. When the soldiers left, Margaret was left alone with him, a stranger she hadn't asked for. She dragged his cot into the barn, fixed him a blanket, and left water by his side. But that night, she couldn't sleep. His eyes haunted her, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in years, someone had looked at her like she was seen. Days passed. She kept her distance. He never asked for help, though she saw how he struggled, using his arms to drag himself from cot to chair, his body trembling with effort. She started leaving him bread and broth by the door. He never said thank you, but she noticed he left her tools sharpened, the water bucket filled. It was as if they had an unspoken truce. You survive your way, I'll survive mine. But things began to shift. One evening, when a dust storm rolled in like a living beast, Margaret rushed to the barn to check on him. The roof was cracking, the wind howling. Taza had managed to brace a wooden beam with his bare arms, saving the structure from collapse. She shouted at him, called him a fool, but he just smiled. That was the first time she saw light in his eyes. Over time, she learned fragments of his story, told in short, measured English. He had been a warrior of the White Mountain Apache, respected and fierce. He'd fought not out of hate, but for his people's right to live free. The bullet that took his legs came from behind, fired during surrender. "They broke my body," he said once, voice low, "but not my spirit." Something about that hit Margaret harder than she wanted to admit, because she, too, had been broken. Not by bullets, but by life's small cruelties. By abandonment, by being treated like she didn't matter. So she began to talk to him. At first, about simple things, the weather, the crops, her late husband's foolish dreams. Then about deeper things, loss, anger, faith. He listened without judgment, and in return, she learned silence could hold more meaning than words. Weeks turned into months. She built him a ramp for the barn door. He showed her how to track animals by broken twigs and footprints. Together, they planted a small garden. And when thieves came one night, thinking a widow and a cripple were easy prey, they found otherwise. Taza fired from his chair with a rifle. Margaret had oiled herself, dropping one man in the dust. The others fled into the dark. That night, as the fire crackled and Taza sat sharpening a blade, Margaret finally smiled. "They thought you were a joke," she said quietly. "Guess the joke's on them." He looked up, eyes glinting. "You made it so," he said simply. From that day forward, people stopped laughing. Word spread of the widow who took in a warrior and turned her desolate farm into a fortress of quiet dignity. When traders passed by, they found her strong again, not because she had wealth, but because she had purpose. And though no one could ever quite explain it, they said when Margaret walked through town beside the chair-bound man, the air seemed to change. People moved aside, not out of pity, but out of respect. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning. For in the years to come, the name Taza Lane would echo across the territory, a name that stood for honor, strength, and redemption. Hello everyone, welcome back. If you heard the first part of this story, you know how a broke widow and a paralyzed Apache warrior defied every cruel expectation the world placed on them. But what happened next is what truly made them legends, a story of honor born from ashes. So, let's begin. By the spring of 1880, the Arizona Territory was changing. The railroad was coming, and with it, greed. Land agents and mercenaries swept across the desert, claiming whatever they could, often at the expense of settlers and tribes alike. The weak were swallowed, the brave were buried, and somewhere between those two fates, Margaret and Taza built something rare: peace. Their small homestead had become a refuge, not just for them, but for travelers, drifters, and even lost children from nearby tribes. The local sheriff once called it a patch of humanity in a world gone mean. Margaret had changed, too. The woman who once trembled at thunder now rode her horse into town with a rifle strapped to her back. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm, and beside her, Taza rolled in his custom-built cart, a wooden frame with iron wheels, made by his own hands. People stared, whispered, even bowed their heads slightly. One morning, word reached them of trouble brewing to the north. A group of hired guns, funded by a greedy land baron named Clive Mercer, was seizing farms, burning out families who refused to sell. Margaret wanted to ignore it. She'd fought too long just to survive. But Taza, quiet as ever, said one thing: honor doesn't stop at your fence. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a broken man, but a leader. The kind she'd only ever read about. So, they prepared. Taza gathered whoever would stand: settlers, a few Apaches, a preacher with a bad leg, even a drunk blacksmith who owed him a favor. He trained them, not for war, but for defense. "We fight not for blood," he said, "but for right." The days that followed turned the dusty plain into a fortress of will. Barricades of stone, traps laid in ravines, signal fires ready to warn of attack. Margaret moved like a woman reborn, tending to the wounded, cooking for the men, loading rifles by firelight. Every night, Taza drew maps in the dirt, explaining how to use the land, its curves, its shadows, its silence, as the greatest weapon. Then came the day the sky turned to gunfire. Mercer's men rode in at dawn, 20 riders, faces hidden under dust masks, rifles gleaming in the light. They came laughing, confident they'd crush a cripple and a widow before breakfast. But when they reached the first ridge, a single shot rang out, and the lead rider fell. The sound of thunder rolled through the valley, followed by a cry that seemed to shake the wind itself. "Stand your ground." It was Taza, sitting tall in his chair, rifle braced against a wooden stand, eyes cold as stone. Bullets hissed through the air, cracking against fences and rocks. Margaret was beside him, firing steady, every shot a promise that she would never be powerless again. The fight raged for hours. Dust turned to smoke, and smoke to silence. By sundown, Mercer's men were gone, leaving behind only fear and the echo of justice. When the sheriff finally rode out days later, he found something that made him pause. The widow's flag, stitched from rags and patched with courage, flew high above the homestead. Beneath it sat Taza, rifle across his lap, staring into the horizon. The sheriff tipped his hat. Heard you defended 3 families and stopped Mercy's men cold, he said quietly. That true? Tazza didn't answer right away. Then he looked toward Margaret, who stood nearby with her hands on her hips, smiling that fierce little smile of hers. She defended what's hers, Tazza said simply. I only reminded her she could. The sheriff nodded, then said something no one expected. The territory's holding a council. They're looking to name someone as a representative, someone folks respect. I can think of no one better than you, Mr. Lane, Margaret gasped. Him, but, the sheriff held up a hand. Don't matter if he can walk. He's the only man who made this land safer. He's earned that seat. And sir, for the first time in frontier history, a paralyzed Apache warrior sat among the leaders of the Arizona Territory, representing settlers and tribes alike. His name, Tazza Lane, the honor of 2 worlds, became a symbol of unity. Years later, when railroads carved across the desert and towns rose from dust, people would tell their children the story of the widow and the warrior who stood against the tide. They'd point to the old homestead and say, that's where courage lived. As for Margaret and Tazza, they never called what they had, love, though it ran deeper than that. They lived side by side, 2 souls tempered by hardship, teaching others that strength doesn't come from muscle or wealth, but from the will to rise again, even when the world laughs. And sometimes, when the wind blew across the valley just right, travelers swore they could still hear their voices, one calm and steady, one warm and strong, carried through the desert like a promise that no one is ever truly broken. Sparkles, thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because more stories of courage, redemption, and unexpected heroes are coming your way. Stay tuned, and never stop believing in second chances.